channel. Today I will be talking about my senior thesis project presentation on the effects of anthropogenic land modifications in a local environment in southern Colorado on insect pollinator populations. I would like to give a special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Fran Sandmeyer, and for Seabase for funding this research project. In our modern world, we are currently suffering from a battle between balancing environmental protection versus economic growth and development. As a result of increased industrialization in developed countries, land use has become a form of common good where main interest focuses on livelihood, productivity, shared benefits, community control, system change, and much less for environmental importances. This has produced many consequences, from which includes population declines in pollinator populations worldwide. Research has shown how the fragmentation in urban development is responsible for the high increase of pollinator species extinctions, and how large-scale transformations of landscapes are linked to extensive and constant losses of native pollinator species. Now, why does this matter? Why are pollinators so important? Research has demonstrated that pollinators are directly and indirectly responsible for several important aspects of our daily lives. The United States Department of Agriculture mentions that pollinators are key to providing ecosystems with clean air, soil, and water through their direct relationship with plants. Pollinators are crucial to the reproduction of wild plants in our fragmented global landscape, since flowering plants are important for their production of clean air through carbon cycling and sequestration. Pollinators also allow flowering plants to purify water and prevent erosion through roots that hold soil in place. And the water cycle depends on plants to return this moisture to the atmosphere, and plants depend on pollinators to help them reproduce. Now, these ecological services then create crucial pieces to our sustenance, such as the production of medicine, both ancestral and modern medicine, including such things as milk thistle to treat liver conditions and high cholesterol. And another crucial product made possible from pollinator services is food, which ultimately secures us the availability to nourishment each and every day. And unfortunately, due to declining rates of pollinators, many plants are also declining dramatically and creating detrimental effects. Pollinators hold a very high economic and ecological importance due to this. As pollinators, they are responsible for the indirect production of medicine, like I mentioned, biofuels, fibers, construction material, and food, like I mentioned as well. And this overall brings the United States over $500 billion per year. Pollinators are extremely important for providing us with much of the food we eat. More than 3,500 species of native bees help increase crop yields that require almost 80% of pollinators by animals, or pollination by animals, And then the direct economic value of insects primarily managed pollinators such as honeybees, bumblebees, and solitary bees within the agricultural industry in Canada and the US has been estimated to be about $1.2 and $19 billion during the 80s. And this call for pollinator structured vegetation has increased by 300% in the past 50 years. And according to the USDA Agricultural Census and the National Agricultural Statistics Service, pollinator economic value within the agricultural industry had sustainably expanded from $34 billion in 2012, and then it continues to grow each and every day. Previous research focused on conservation biology and measuring correlations between land use and declining rates of pollinators, especially at a consistent temporal and spatial level, is a very new topic to the field. Anthropology, or pollinator biology, has recently started to focus on plant-pollinator relationships in the sense of both native plant and pollinator species declining rates, and due to an increased interest in topics concerning the consequences of anthropogenic disturbances such as global warming, pollution, climate change, and many other things. Some of the current studies in anthropology have suggested that main issues causing the declining rates of pollinator species have to do mainly with pesticide applications, habitat loss, or land modification. and invasive species. Those studies that have focused on habitat loss or land modification and invasive species have shown that the inclusion of ornamental or exotic plants in landscapes can create changes in native plant abundance by disrupting mutualistic interactions between native plants and their pollinators. Similarly, visitation rates by specialized pollinators can decrease due to the abundance of exotic plant species and intensity of land use, leading to the decline of specialized vegetation and the promotion of generalist plants and pollinators. However, the effects of intensity on land modification can have variable effects on different species of pollinators since they all have such diverse life histories. The purpose of the study I made was to examine how increases of anthropogenic land modification are affecting local population rates of different species of native and non-native pollinators, while analyzing how this can ultimately modify composition between mutualistic plant-pollinator relationships within a semi-arid environment. Having minimal importance given to researching more on pollinator populations, especially those that are wild species, and the impacts of anthropogenic land modifications have on them at a local scale may contribute to massive extinction of present native plants and pollinator species that greatly assist the production of many important resources, and is why this research is so important. From previous research and trends, I hypothesized that if land had non-native landscaping, or in other words, was highly disturbed, then there would be a decline in pollinator abundance and richness, and there would be a change in the composition of species in the area. To test this, I first identified 10 sites to conduct surveys on at Colorado State University, Pueblo. 5 of the sites had heavy land use, meaning that they were heavily disturbed or considered landscaped areas. And then the other 5 sites had low land use, meaning that plenty of the native vegetation existed in that area compared to other areas on campus, or if it had a few anthropogenic land modifications. And then each site was about 100 meters apart from each other. After sites were designated, I conducted pollinator plant surveys. I would have a random direction selected, and it was developed through a random number generator and a compass. And I also made sure to write down temperature, cloud cover, and moistness each and every day of the surveys. And I accounted for all of this in order to sort of keep track of what was occurring each and every day. And then plants were identified through pictures. I just used my phone to take certain pictures since this was a very limited study with equipment. And then I would then do the 10-minute observations for pollinator visitors. And this included pollinator identification through the pictures that I would take and through field guides that I used. We identified pollinator species that were only observed in visited natural areas, ones that only were observed in the landscaped areas, and then those that were observed in both landscaped and natural areas. And then we later grouped these categories as native species, non-native species, and then generalist. We also compared species found in our study to that found in McFarland and al. Study from the year 1989, which analyzed pollinators in a different perspective than we did in our study, but it also provided us a little bit of information on some of the pollinators present in the same local area that we were studying, which was at Colorado State University, Pueblo. We also ran mixed model regressions with sampling sites as a random variable to determine whether pollinator abundance, or number of individuals, and the richness, or number of species of pollinators, varied between landscaped and natural sites. We ran a contingency analysis to compare visitation rates of species found in both landscaped and natural areas to determine whether these were more generalist populations of pollinators that preferred one habitat type over another. So a total of 145 surveys were conducted in this study belonging to 52 morphospecies. 12 species were only found in the landscaped areas, 16 species were only found in the natural areas, and 34 species were found on both landscaped and natural sites. And from the species found on both disturbed and natural sites, we had a total of 250 individuals that were recorded and accounted for. The abundance of pollinators present did not vary between landscapes and natural areas. So after conducting our mixed model regressions, we found that the p-value was about 0.21, and then the richness of pollinator species did not vary either between disturbed or natural sites. We found that after conducting our mixed model regressions, we had a p-value of 0.73. However, the species composition did not show, or it did show, a significant effect between landscaped and natural sites. The chi-square value ended up being 40.09, and then our p-value was 0.015, or in other words, significant. And here, the mosaic plot on the right demonstrates the different species types by color and frequency by the size of each colored block. So species such as 19, which was a small ant, is represented here in the greenish color blocks and were mostly found on natural land and not very much on disturbed land. Another example of this is species 48, which is represented in brown here in the blocks. And this was a hoverfly, and this species was found more often on disturbed land than on natural land. And from this mosaic plot, it can be implied that some pollinators had a preference in land type, while others showed no true preference between the two different land type uses. We found that the only species that was clearly identified to be the same from our study and McFarland's study from 1989 was the solitary wood borer bee, or Lithurgus apicalis crescent. From the analysis conducted, I concluded that land use change can affect species in highly variable ways within and across taxa. In this study, some species appeared to be diet specialist, while others appeared to be diet generalist. It is important to note that dietary specialists tend to have greater sensitivity to land use than generalists, since generalists can adapt to consuming nectar of various plants, while generalists cannot do so in an efficient way. I also add that spatial scale experience is different for each species. From previous research, it has been found that it is linked to its trophic level and traits such as body size, resource specialization, rarity, and population size variability. In this study, I found that resource specialization and or trophic level was often a potential indicator to why certain species appeared more on disturbed land over natural land, and vice versa. And not enough information or statistical analysis was available in the study to compare rarity and population sizability, but from studying morphology of the species that were found, there were none that were rare or invasive to Colorado besides one wasp species. Finding that the only species that was clearly identified to be the same from our study and McFarland's study from 1989 was this being the solitary wood borer bee, could suggest that there might have been an increase of other bee pollinators as well as other pollinators in general to compete with those pollinators found in the areas 30 years ago, from what we found comparing species found in the study versus ours. So this can suggest that although some of the same pollinators exist today in this area, landscaping could have both increased their populations due to an increase of food resources and possibly change competitive dynamics with more generalist species. There needs to be more research to be able to determine how much habitat loss is affecting global pollinator declines at such a rapid rate. So to do so, we need to find and assess the extent to which the existing studies represent the status of global ecosystems. For this to be able to happen, there needs to be more awareness and investment to pollinator research and conservation efforts overall. In order to further understand pollinator declines, we need to create more studies that examine change in diversity. We tend to see many studies on honeybee declines, but not much is known about other pollinating species, especially insects. And this kind of mainly has to do with the increase of importance with economics over ecological importances. And also, to extend the findings of this study, I believe that the methods of the study should expand to different areas in Pueblo, not just concentrate on a university, which was Colorado State University Pueblo, but also to different locations around the area, which are heavily understudied. I believe it is also important to further examine pesticide levels in urban development to truly understand the variables that are affecting pollinator populations because, as I mentioned previously, there can be many contributing factors to their declines. And finally, in order to improve issues concerning species declines at a local scale, we should invest time and efforts into creating more gardens to support all types of pollinator communities. I believe a great start here in Pueblo that could be a part of this is a pretty good suggestion for the inclusion of more gardens around our campus. We already have a few of these gardens, which I found in the study to be helpful for certain pollinators, and therefore I believe that by implementing more gardens, we could increase the composition, the diversity, the richness, and all these factors for pollinator populations, whether they be native or non-native. They could still do their task and increase ecological services that provide us or our campus with a lot greater health. And with these future directions, we could see changes in pollinator population declines at a larger scale and avoid further destruction of such important components to the health of our planet. I leave this presentation open for questions. Thank you so much. And here are my references.